In the early 19th century, in the coal-stained northeast of England, in the small county of Durham, a girl was born into a world where survival was never guaranteed and comfort was a luxury few could imagine. Her name was Mary Ann Cotton, though at birth in 1832 she was known as Mary Ann Robson. The world she entered was harsh, industrial, and unforgiving. Coal mines carved into the earth like open wounds, and the men who descended into them each morning did so with a quiet understanding that they might never return. It was a time when death was not a stranger, but a frequent visitor, slipping easily into homes already crowded with hunger, illness, and exhaustion. In that bleak landscape, where soot clung to skin and hope often felt like a fragile rumor, Mary Ann's story quietly began. Her father, Michael Robson, was a miner, like so many men in the region. Mining was not simply a job. It was a gamble with fate, played daily in darkness and dust. When Mary Ann was still a young child, that gamble was lost. Her father died in a mining accident, one of countless nameless tragedies swallowed by the industrial age. For a family already living on the edge, his death was more than emotional devastation, it was economic disaster. The fragile structure, holding their lives together, collapsed overnight. Mary Ann's mother was left to pick up the pieces, to remarry in hopes of stability, and to shield her children from a reality that offered little mercy. But children absorb more than adults realize. In that small, grieving household, Mary Ann learned her first lessons about loss, about vulnerability, and about how quickly a life could be reduced to a memory. The England of her childhood was a place where disease moved swiftly and explanations moved slowly. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis drifted through towns like invisible predators. People fell ill suddenly and died just as suddenly, and few questions were asked. Medicine was still primitive, and understanding of toxins or pathology was limited. When someone died after days of vomiting and weakness, it was often attributed to gastric fever or some vague ailment that required no further investigation. This constant presence of death shaped the psychology of entire communities. Grief was common, almost routine. Funerals were frequent, and black clothing was an ordinary sight. For a young girl like Mary Ann, death was not shocking. It was familiar. As she grew older, those who knew her would later describe her as neat, composed, and quietly observant. There was nothing outwardly alarming about her. She was not wild or rebellious. She did not stand out in ways that would make neighbors whisper. If anything, she blended in perfectly with the expectations placed upon working-class girls of the time. She learned domestic skills. She understood the importance of appearance and reputation. In a society where a woman's survival often depended on marriage, she absorbed the unspoken rule that security came not from independence, but from attachment to a man who could provide. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something more calculating may have been forming. Poverty has a way of sharpening the mind in unexpected directions. When a child grows up watching stability vanish in a single accident, watching a mother scramble for survival, she may begin to view the world not as a place of trust, but as a chessboard where security must be secured by any means necessary. Education for girls in her position was limited, but Mary Ann was not unintelligent. She learned quickly, especially when it came to understanding people. She observed how sympathy worked, how tragedy drew neighbors closer, how widows were pitied and sometimes financially supported. She saw how communities rallied around loss, how collections were taken up for grieving families, how insurance policies, still a growing practice in Victorian Britain, offered small payouts when a breadwinner died. These were not dramatic revelations. They were quiet observations gathered over years of watching life unfold in a town where misfortune was common currency. While other children may have simply accepted these patterns, Mary Ann appeared to study them. As she entered adolescence, the expectations of womanhood tightened around her. Marriage was not just romantic possibility, it was economic strategy. A young woman without property or wealth needed a husband to secure her future. Remaining single meant dependence, perhaps even destitution. Mary Ann understood this reality well. She also understood the power of presentation. By many accounts, she was attractive in a modest, respectable way. She carried herself with composure. She knew how to speak gently, how to appear devoted and attentive. In a world where men sought wives who could manage households and raise children, she seemed an ideal candidate. There was no sign, at least on the surface, of the darkness history would later associate with her name. In her late teens, she began working as a nurse or domestic servant, roles that placed her inside other people's homes and close to illness and vulnerability. Nursing in the mid-1800s was not the regulated professional field it would later become. It was intimate, practical, and often unstructured. A nurse tended to the sick, prepared meals, administered basic remedies, and remained present at the bedside during long nights of suffering. Through this work, Mary Ann gained familiarity with the rhythms of illness, the symptoms, the complaints, the gradual decline. She witnessed how families reacted to sickness, how fear and hope battled in whispered conversations, how death certificates were written with minimal scrutiny. If she had already learned that death was common, she was now learning how it unfolded step by step inside a body. There is something chilling in hindsight about this stage of her life, not because it was abnormal, but because it was so ordinary. Nothing about her early years screamed of violence. There were no public outbursts, no arrests, no scandals. She was simply a young woman navigating the limited options available to her. Yet history often teaches us that the most unsettling stories begin in normalcy. The foundations of future crimes are rarely dramatic at first. They are laid quietly, brick by brick, in experiences that seem harmless when viewed in isolation. For Mary Ann, those bricks were poverty, early exposure to death, social expectations of marriage, and a growing awareness of how misfortune could translate into financial relief. By the time she reached her early 20s, she was ready to step fully into adult life. In 1852, she married William Mowbray, a laborer who, like many men of his class, sought stability and companionship. To outside observers, it was a conventional union. A young couple building a future together, hoping for children, hoping for modest prosperity. Marriage offered Mary Ann what she had lacked since childhood, a sense of security, or at least the appearance of it. But security in Victorian England was fragile. Employment could disappear. Illness could strike without warning. And insurance policies, those small financial cushions against tragedy, were becoming more common among working families seeking protection against the unpredictable. As a wife, Mary Ann appeared dutiful. She bore children, managed the household, and maintained her composed demeanor. Neighbors would have seen nothing extraordinary. If anything, they may have pitied her when hardship visited her home, because hardship was expected. Infant mortality rates were painfully high in the 19th century. It was not unusual for families to lose multiple children to disease before they reached adulthood. When sickness entered a household, it was seen as misfortune, not malice. This cultural context would later prove significant, but at this early stage, it simply blended into the background of everyday life. To understand the seeds of what was to come, one must imagine the psychological landscape of a woman shaped by constant instability. She had learned that men could die suddenly in mines. She had learned that children could be buried before they learned to speak. She had learned that widows sometimes received sympathy, sometimes money, sometimes both. And she had learned, through her work, how illness looked and felt. Whether these lessons consciously merged into intention is something history cannot definitively answer. But patterns rarely emerge from nowhere. They grow from repeated exposure, from beliefs slowly reinforced over years. There is also the matter of control. In a society where women possessed little legal or financial power, control was scarce. A married woman's property often belonged to her husband. Her social mobility was limited. Her identity was tied to her role as wife and mother. For some, this structure was simply accepted. For others, it may have felt suffocating. If Mary Ann desired more than dependence, if she longed for financial certainty not tied to a single fragile source, she would have had few legitimate avenues to pursue it. Ambition in a poor Victorian woman had little room to breathe. And yet, outwardly, her life continued without scandal. She moved through her community as many women did, attending to domestic duties, caring for the sick, presenting herself as respectable. Nothing in those early years would have warned her neighbors that they were witnessing the quiet formation of one of Britain's most notorious female killers. There were no headlines yet, no suspicions. Just a young woman shaped by loss, sharpened by hardship, and positioned within a society where death was common and questions were rare. When we look back at the beginning of Mary Ann Cotton's life, it is tempting to search for a single moment that explains everything. A traumatic event, a visible shift, a dramatic turning point. But real life is rarely that simple. The making of a criminal mind if that is indeed what was forming, often happens gradually. It is influenced by environment, opportunity, social norms, and personal choices woven together over time. In the soot-covered towns of northern England, amid the echo of mining tools and the tolling of church bells for the dead, Mary Ann's character was being shaped in ways no one could yet comprehend. By the time adulthood fully claimed her, the essential elements were already in place. Familiarity with death, awareness of financial compensation tied to loss, skill in caregiving, and a calm, unremarkable exterior that invited trust rather than suspicion. She was not yet the figure history would condemn. She was a wife, a mother, a nurse, a widow in waiting perhaps, moving through a world that normalized tragedy. But beneath that normalcy, something quiet and dangerous may have been awakening, a belief that misfortune was not only survivable, but usable. And in a society unprepared to question repeated tragedy within a single household, that belief would one day find room to grow. After surviving the harsh realities of her childhood and learning to navigate the cruel uncertainties of life in the coal towns of northern England, Mary Ann Cotton stepped into adulthood with a cautious determination. By the time she reached her early 20s, the pressures of Victorian society weighed heavily on her. In those years, a woman's social and economic security was intimately tied to marriage, and Mary Ann understood that reality as well as any young woman could. In 1852, at the age of 20, she married William Mowbray, a laborer who appeared to offer stability and companionship. Their union, on the surface, seemed ordinary, an unremarkable young couple attempting to carve out a life amidst the daily grind of coal-dusted streets and overworked mills. They moved into a small rented home, a modest establishment that barely contained the basic necessities of life, but it was theirs. Mary Ann assumed the expected roles of wife and soon, mother. The couple had children, and for a brief time, her life appeared to be unfolding as society expected. But within a few short years, the ordinary veil of domesticity began to thin, revealing the first shadows of a darker narrative. Tragedy struck early. One by one, Mary Ann's children became ill. The first, a boy, suffered prolonged bouts of vomiting and fever. His small body weakened daily, and no home remedy or physician's care seemed to help. Neighbors whispered about the common perils of infant mortality, which was, at the time, heartbreakingly normal. By the standards of the period, it was easy to dismiss the deaths of children as inevitable misfortune. One child's passing was a sorrow, two, a cruel twist of fate. But as her children continued to die, each under the care of a seemingly devoted mother, the pattern began to attract subtle notice. Yet no one outside the home suspected malevolence. Death was a frequent visitor, and grief had become routine in these tightly knit communities. The quiet streets, lined with soot-stained cottages, were accustomed to mourning. The real turning point came when William, her husband, fell ill. The illness seemed sudden and inexplicable at first. He complained of weakness, nausea, and pain, but within a matter of weeks, he too succumbed. Again, in an era of poor sanitation, limited medical knowledge, and frequent outbreaks of disease, such deaths were tragically common. The community offered condolences, mourned a laborer who had worked hard and died young, and life went on. Few considered the possibility that these successive tragedies, so neatly aligned around one household, could have been anything other than ill fate. But for Mary Ann, the events were more than personal misfortune. They were opportunity. When William Mowbray died, Mary Ann collected life insurance payouts and other small inheritances available to widows. These sums, while modest, were significant for someone born into poverty, raised amid loss, and constantly seeking stability. Financial security was no longer a distant dream. It was a tangible reward, achieved under circumstances the wider world considered unfortunate but natural. And yet, what distinguished Mary Ann from most widows was her perception of these outcomes. Each death brought her not only grief, but gain. Each loss reinforced an unspoken lesson that mortality could be navigated, even manipulated, to create advantage. What might have been innocent timing or coincidence for another person became for Mary Ann a pattern of possibility. Widowhood did not slow her. In a society where single women often faced economic hardship, Mary Ann's solution was, perhaps pragmatically, remarriage. She married again, seeking the social and financial protections marriage afforded. This second husband, like the first, would find himself caught in the currents of Marianne's life. Over time, children would be born, become ill, and die under her care, and the husband would follow. To the untrained eye, these were tragic accidents, a cruel echo of the child mortality statistics that haunted the region. But gradually, an unnerving consistency began to emerge. The same home, the same mother, the same fatal pattern. What outsiders saw as unlucky coincidences, Marianne experienced as a combination of timing, opportunity, and understanding human vulnerability. As she moved from one marriage to the next, Marianne's behavior reflected the complex navigation of both social expectation and personal calculation. Outwardly, she remained the dutiful wife, the grieving mother, the neighborly friend. She attended church, maintained her household, and engaged in the daily rituals that made her appear ordinary, respectable even. There was no hint of menace in her demeanor. She smiled, she consoled, she presented herself as a victim of circumstance, just as often as she was a participant in it. Her charm and composure were essential tools, allowing her to move through communities without raising alarm, and to ensure that every death within her household could be explained away as misfortune rather than malicious intent. In the mid-19th century, social perception was everything, and Marianne mastered it with quiet precision. The cumulative effect of these early marriages was the gradual building of a dark resume. Deaths were no longer isolated incidents. They were becoming a recognizable, if unacknowledged, pattern. Yet, in an era with rudimentary forensic science and little institutional oversight, suspicion was slow to emerge. Doctors had limited means to identify poison, coroner reports were inconsistent, and families often accepted deaths as inevitable tragedies. Insurance policies were still new, but payouts for accidental or unexpected deaths were enough to attract Marianne's careful attention. With each successive marriage, she became increasingly familiar with the intersection of human vulnerability and financial opportunity. She learned which illnesses could plausibly account for a sudden death, how neighbors interpreted grief, and how quickly suspicion faded when a household was outwardly devoted and compliant. Her actions were methodical, though disguised under layers of apparent normalcy. Marianne did not act recklessly. She did not broadcast her intentions. Instead, she observed and adapted, understanding how to exploit the gaps between societal norms, medical knowledge, and the everyday routines of domestic life. Children were often the first victims, but husbands followed, and each incident reinforced a cold logic she seemed to internalize, that life, when guided by careful planning, could yield rewards, even from tragedy. The skill lay in maintaining appearances, and Marianne excelled at this. She learned when to cry, when to comfort, when to retreat. She learned that people trust what is familiar, and she made herself the most familiar figure in every home she inhabited. During this period, Marianne also cultivated her understanding of social networks, learning how communities responded to death. Neighborly assistance, donations, church collections, and general goodwill were all accessible when someone was perceived as a victim of misfortune. Widows often received support precisely because they were seen as vulnerable. Marianne's keen observation of these dynamics likely informed her later actions. She recognized that sympathy could be leveraged, that grief could create opportunities, and that social perception could act as both shield and amplifier. In effect, she began to manipulate the invisible currency of trust and compassion that governed Victorian community life, a skill that would later define her infamy. At the same time, her marriages provided insight into the limitations and vulnerabilities of men who believed themselves in control. Husbands were often unaware of their wives' internal calculations, focused instead on labor, on providing, and on maintaining social standing. Marianne exploited this focus, moving within the domestic sphere with freedom that few questioned. She understood routines, dietary habits, and the minute details of caregiving that allowed her to influence outcomes without detection. By integrating herself into every aspect of domestic life, she positioned herself in ways that maximized her advantage while minimizing exposure. The ordinary actions of pouring tea, preparing meals, and attending to children became a sophisticated choreography, a seamless blend of performance and manipulation that masked deadly intentions. Tragically, the repetition of loss in her households did not immediately trigger widespread suspicion. Mortality was expected, especially in infants, and husbands dying young, while less common, were not unheard of in industrial towns where accidents, infections, and poor medical care were daily realities. This societal backdrop enabled Mary Ann to continue her sequence of marriages, deaths, and inheritances without interference for years. What might appear, to a modern reader, as an obvious pattern, remained hidden under the guise of routine misfortune. It was a combination of skill, timing, and the social and medical limitations of the era that allowed her to proceed unchallenged. Yet, beneath the surface, this pattern was establishing a foundation for the dark legacy she would become infamous for. Each death reinforced her knowledge, sharpened her instincts, and normalized a perspective where life could be guided, manipulated, and ended according to calculation rather than circumstance alone. She observed reactions, noted procedures, and internalized lessons from every loss. The deaths were no longer merely events. They were data points, lessons, and tools, gradually constructing a framework for a lethal strategy that she would execute with chilling precision in the years to follow. Mary Ann's second marriage, like the first, was followed by children and tragedy. She married and remarried, each husband and household providing insight, each death offering lessons on how to remain undetected, and each payout reinforcing the practical benefits of her methods. She moved fluidly through social and familial circles, maintaining appearances while cultivating experience. By her late 20s, the cumulative effect of these experiences had produced a woman who was socially adept, financially aware, and increasingly comfortable navigating the space between tragedy and opportunity. Her understanding of life and death was no longer theoretical. It was practical, refined, and intimately applied. Through this period, Mary Ann also demonstrated an ability to manage perception. She cultivated relationships with neighbors, church officials, and local authorities. She attended to social obligations, engaged in community rituals, and displayed appropriate emotion at funerals. Her outward persona, a grieving mother, a devoted wife, a conscientious member of society, provided her with a protective cloak. It obscured the emerging patterns within her private life and allowed her actions to proceed largely unchallenged. In a time when women had limited power, this ability to command perception became a formidable tool, one she wielded with sophistication. By the end of this chapter in her life, Mary Ann had effectively merged survival instincts with strategic foresight. Her early exposure to death, her awareness of economic vulnerabilities, and her mastery of social navigation had combined into a skill set that was as dangerous as it was undetectable. The ordinary events of her daily life, the care of children, the management of a household, the performance of mourning, became instruments of control. Through careful observation and methodical repetition, she had begun to understand how to bend circumstances to her advantage, how to extract benefit from misfortune, and how to maintain trust while orchestrating death. In retrospect, it is clear that these early marriages and the subsequent pattern of losses were more than coincidence. They were formative experiences that laid the groundwork for what history would later record as a chilling, deliberate trajectory. Mary Ann Cotton had learned to navigate the interplay of mortality, social expectation, and financial opportunity. She had discovered, in essence, the mechanics of survival and profit in an unforgiving society, a dark apprenticeship that would ultimately culminate in her notoriety. While her contemporaries may have seen only a succession of unfortunate events, the careful observer looking back can trace the emergence of a calculated, methodical mind, learning from each tragedy, perfecting methods, and preparing for a sequence of actions that would one day shock a nation. Through the lens of time, Mary Ann's marriages and the deaths surrounding them appear as a grim education. Each household, each loss, each payout was a step in the development of her lethal acuity. It was during these years that she refined the skills, strategies, and understanding that would enable her to manipulate life and death with an almost clinical precision. The ordinary girl born in a mining town had transformed into a woman who understood, with terrifying clarity, the intersection of human vulnerability and opportunity, and it was only a matter of time before her dark potential would be realized in full. As the years passed and the pattern of marriage followed by mourning became almost routine in her life, Mary Ann Cotton moved into a far more deliberate and dangerous phase of her story. By now, She was no longer simply a woman navigating tragedy. She was a woman who understood how tragedy worked. She understood how illness looked, how it unfolded, how it was explained away, and most importantly, how it could be disguised. The England of the mid-19th century unknowingly provided her with the perfect weapon, one that was inexpensive, easily obtainable, and almost impossible to detect with the medical knowledge of the time. That weapon was arsenic. Arsenic was everywhere in Victorian Britain. It was sold openly in shops, commonly used in rat poison, pest control, and even in certain household products. There were few regulations restricting its purchase. Anyone could walk into a store and buy it under the pretense of killing vermin. Its appearance was deceptively innocent, a white powder that could blend effortlessly into food or drink without altering taste or smell in any obvious way. But its true power lay in something far more sinister. Its symptoms mimicked natural illness. Victims would suffer stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, and dehydration. To doctors of the era, these signs pointed toward cholera, dysentery, or gastric fever. Rarely did anyone suspect poison, especially not when the caretaker was a devoted wife or mother. Mary Ann Cotton understood this reality intimately. Through her work as a nurse and caregiver, she had observed the progression of illness countless times. She knew how long someone could linger before death. She knew how to appear attentive, how to call for a doctor at the right moment, how to weep convincingly at the bedside. She had learned that suspicion often dissolves in the presence of visible grief. And so, with chilling patience, she began to incorporate arsenic into her method. Her third husband, George Ward, became one of the first clear examples of this calculated escalation. George was not a wealthy man, but he was insured. Insurance had become increasingly popular among working-class families as a way to provide security in case of sudden death. Policies were small but meaningful. For someone raised in poverty, these payouts represented stability. When George fell ill, the symptoms were familiar violent stomach pains, weakness, prolonged suffering. Mary Ann tended to him faithfully, according to neighbors. She remained by his side, presenting herself as the picture of devotion. And when he finally died, the explanation was accepted without resistance. Another unfortunate victim of illness in a time when medicine could not save everyone. But George was not the only one. The most horrifying aspect of Mary Ann's story is not merely the number of husbands who died, it is the number of children. Children who depended entirely on her for nourishment and care. Children whose fragile bodies were especially vulnerable to poison. Arsenic does not need to be administered in large amounts to be lethal. Small doses over time can weaken a body gradually, creating a believable narrative of natural decline. Mary Ann appeared to understand dosing with frightening precision. Some victims died quickly, others deteriorated over days or weeks. The variability itself protected her, because no two cases looked exactly alike. The Victorian era's high child mortality rate worked in her favor. Losing a child was tragically common. Families buried infants with heartbreaking regularity. It was not unusual for a mother to lose multiple children. So when Mary Ann's children fell ill one by one, few questioned it. They pitied her. They brought food. They attended funerals. They whispered about cruel fate. But behind closed doors, a pattern was taking shape that would later shock a nation. What makes this stage of her life particularly disturbing is the apparent emotional detachment she displayed. Witnesses described her as calm, composed, rarely hysterical. She mourned, yes, but never excessively. She seemed to move forward quickly after each burial, ready to begin again, ready to marry again, ready to rebuild another household. Each new relationship represented another opportunity for insurance policies to be purchased. In several cases, she herself encouraged husbands to take out insurance, framing it as a responsible step for the protection of their family. It was a persuasive argument, especially in dangerous industrial towns where men could die in mines or factories without warning. Arsenic offered her not just a method, but control. Control over timing, control over pacing, control over outcome. In a society where women had limited authority, poison gave her power in secret. She could decide when illness began. She could decide when it ended. She could choose the moment to summon a doctor, ensuring that medical attention came too late to reverse the damage, but early enough to appear concerned. This illusion of helplessness was essential to her survival. Her fourth husband, James Robinson, marked another chilling chapter. Robinson was aware of her past losses, but accepted her explanations. Widowhood was not unusual, and sympathy often overpowered suspicion. During their marriage, Robinson's relatives and children began to suffer from mysterious illnesses. Not all of them died, but enough fell sick to create a quiet unease within the household. Robinson himself became ill, though he survived longer than some of her previous husbands. Eventually, the strain of repeated sickness and financial tension led to the breakdown of the marriage. For the first time, someone close to her began to feel something was not right. Though he could not prove wrongdoing, the pattern of illness surrounding Mary Ann began to raise faint alarms. Yet she moved on again. Frederick Cotton would become one of her most infamous husbands, and it is under his name that she would eventually become widely known. By the time she married Frederick, Mary Ann had already buried multiple spouses and numerous children. Still, Frederick trusted her. He ensured himself, and crucially, his children from a previous marriage. Once again, illness crept into the household. Frederick's sons grew weak and pale. Frederick himself began experiencing severe gastric distress. As always, Mary Ann played the role of devoted caretaker. Frederick Cotton died in 1872 after a prolonged illness that doctors attributed to typhoid fever or gastric complications. His death on its own might not have sparked suspicion, but what followed did. His young son, Charles Edward Cotton, remained in the house under Mary Ann's care. The boy soon became ill with similar symptoms: vomiting, weakness, dehydration. By this point, however, local authorities had begun noticing the extraordinary number of deaths connected to Mary Ann. A parish official named Thomas Riley reportedly grew suspicious when Mary Ann inquired about placing the boy in the workhouse only to collect insurance money if he died first. When Charles Edward Cotton died, Riley insisted on further examination. This time, a post-mortem was conducted. Advances in toxicology had begun to make arsenic detectable in the body through chemical testing methods such as the Marsh test. The results were damning. Large quantities of arsenic were found in the child's system. For the first time, science caught up with suspicion. The discovery opened the floodgates. Authorities began re-examining previous deaths associated with Mary Ann Cotton. Exhumations were ordered. Bodies that had been buried quietly were brought back into investigation. In case after case, traces of arsenic were found. The pattern that had once been invisible now stood in horrifying clarity. What had been dismissed as misfortune was revealed as method. What had been accepted as tragedy was exposed as calculation. It is difficult to comprehend the psychological landscape that allowed Mary Ann to continue for so long. Was it greed alone? Perhaps partly. Insurance money provided stability and freedom from poverty, but there was also something deeper and apparent comfort with death, an ability to detach emotionally from those around her, and a chilling confidence in her own cleverness. Each successful poisoning likely reinforced her belief that she could outsmart society, outmaneuver suspicion, and remain untouchable. By the time of her arrest in 1872, Mary Ann Cotton was suspected of killing as many as 21 people, including husbands, lovers, and at least 11 children, many of them her own. Not all charges could be proven, but the pattern was undeniable. Arsenic had been her silent accomplice, a weapon that left behind symptoms easily mistaken for disease, administered under the guise of care and affection. Her story during this phase is not one of impulsive violence, but of deliberate, calculated repetition. It was the steady application of knowledge she had accumulated over years, knowledge of illness, of insurance, of social trust, and of medical limitations. She exploited every weakness in the system. She exploited love, dependency, and sympathy. She exploited the very fabric of Victorian domestic life, where a wife's role as caregiver granted her unquestioned access to food, drink, and medicine. As the evidence mounted and her carefully constructed facade began to crumble, the full horror of her actions came into focus. Communities that had once pitied her now recoiled. Neighbors who had offered condolences felt betrayed. The image of the grieving widow dissolved, replaced by the face of a calculating serial poisoner. And at the center of it all was arsenic, the silent, invisible powder that had allowed her to transform ordinary meals into instruments of death. In this chapter of her life, Mary Ann Cotton perfected her method. She turned domestic routine into a deadly ritual. She transformed the role of nurturer into that of executioner, and for years, She succeeded because society was not prepared to suspect a woman, a mother, a nurse. But once science intervened and arsenic was revealed, the illusion collapsed. The weapon that had empowered her ultimately exposed her. The poison that had secured her financial survival became the evidence that sealed her fate. By the time suspicion finally began to gather around Mary Ann Cotton, it did not arrive dramatically, with shouting accusations or immediate arrest. Instead, it crept in quietly, the way doubt often does through small inconsistencies, uneasy instincts, and the subtle realization that coincidence can only stretch so far before it begins to tear. For years, death had followed her from town to town, from marriage to marriage, from cradle to cradle. But Victorian England was changing. Medical science was advancing. Record-keeping was improving. And communities, though slow to accuse, were not entirely blind. When Frederick Cotton died in 1872, his passing initially appeared to be just another chapter in Mary Ann's long history of misfortune. He had suffered from severe gastric distress vomiting, stomach pain, weakness, the same familiar symptoms that had claimed so many others connected to her. Doctors attributed it to typhoid fever or a similar illness. Such diagnoses were common, almost routine. Yet beneath the surface, there were murmurs. Frederick had seemed healthy before his decline. The illness had come on swiftly. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, this was not the first husband of Mary Ann's to die in such a manner. After Frederick's death, his young son from a previous marriage, Charles Edward Cotton, remained in the household under Mary Ann's care. The boy was delicate but not critically ill, at least not at first. But soon enough, he too began to show signs of sickness. The now familiar pattern emerged: nausea, weakness, persistent vomiting. For Mary Ann, this must have felt like the continuation of a formula she had perfected. But this time, the environment around her was slightly different. This time, someone was paying closer attention. A parish official named Thomas Riley had begun to observe the strange rhythm of tragedy surrounding her. Riley was not a detective, nor was he a scientist. He was simply a man responsible for overseeing poor relief and parish matters. But he had noticed something troubling. Mary Ann had made inquiries about placing young Charles in the workhouse, a state institution for the poor, while also ensuring that insurance policies remained active on the child's life. The combination struck him as suspicious. Why would a woman seeking to surrender a child to institutional care still be concerned about his insurance coverage? The question lingered in Riley's mind long after their conversation ended. When Charles Edward Cotton died shortly afterward in 1872, Riley refused to let the matter pass quietly. He insisted that an inquest be conducted. This was a pivotal moment in the unraveling of Mary Ann Cotton's carefully constructed facade. For years, she had relied on the assumption that no one would look too closely, that doctors would attribute symptoms to common diseases, that grief would silence suspicion. But now, for the first time, official scrutiny was applied to a death in her household with genuine skepticism. A post-mortem examination was ordered. By this point in history, toxicology had advanced significantly from the early decades of the century. The Marsh test, developed in the 1830s, allowed for more reliable detection of arsenic in human tissue. It was not perfect, but it was far more effective than earlier methods. When the examination of young Charles's body was completed, the results were shocking. Large quantities of arsenic were discovered in his system, far beyond what could be explained by accidental contamination. The discovery changed everything. What had once been whispers became headlines. Mary Ann Cotton was arrested and charged with the murder of Charles Edward Cotton. The calm, grieving widow was now a suspect in a poisoning case that threatened to expose far more than a single crime. News spread quickly through the community. Neighbors who had once brought food and sympathy began to re-examine their memories. They recalled the number of funerals. They counted the graves. They began to ask questions they had never dared to voice. How could one woman endure so many losses? How could so many healthy individuals decline so rapidly under her care? The answers, once obscured by the haze of Victorian mortality rates, now seemed disturbingly clear. Authorities widened their investigation. They did not stop with Charles. They began reviewing the records of Mary Ann's previous husbands and children. Death certificates were examined. Burial sites were identified. In some cases, bodies were exhumed for further analysis. It was a grim and unsettling process. one that forced communities to confront the possibility that the tragedies they had accepted as fate were in fact deliberate acts of murder. As exhumations proceeded, the same chemical signature appeared again and again. Arsenic was detected in multiple remains. Each discovery reinforced the growing belief that Mary Ann Cotton was not a victim of misfortune, but its architect. The pattern, once invisible, now stood stark and undeniable. Throughout this process, Mary Ann maintained her composure. Witnesses described her as calm, almost detached. She denied wrongdoing. She insisted that the accusations were unfair, that illness had plagued her family through no fault of her own. In an era where women were rarely seen as violent criminals, some still struggled to reconcile the image of a mother with the evidence of poison. But science was less sentimental than society. The chemical tests did not weep. They did not sympathize. They simply revealed. Her trial began in March 1873 at Durham Assizes. The courtroom was crowded, packed with journalists, townspeople, and curious onlookers eager to witness the proceedings. The case had attracted national attention. The idea of a female serial poisoner was both horrifying and sensational. Newspapers followed every detail, turning Mary Ann into a figure of morbid fascination. The prosecution focused primarily on the murder of Charles Edward Cotton, as it was the strongest case supported by forensic evidence. Witnesses testified about her inquiries regarding insurance policies, her conversation with Thomas Riley, and the symptoms preceding Charles's death. Medical experts explained the presence of arsenic in the boy's body and described how it could have been administered gradually through food or drink. The defense attempted to challenge the reliability of toxicology tests, arguing that arsenic could have been accidentally ingested or that contamination might have occurred during burial. They emphasized the high rates of illness during the period and portrayed Mary Ann as a woman persecuted by cruel coincidence. But the cumulative weight of evidence was difficult to ignore. The prosecution painted a picture of methodical poisoning motivated by financial gain, a pattern stretching across years in multiple households. As testimony unfolded, the public's perception shifted dramatically. The grieving widow image dissolved completely. In its place stood the figure of a calculating woman who had exploited trust, manipulated sympathy, and used her position as caregiver to administer death. The contrast was chilling. The very qualities that had shielded her, calmness, domestic competence, maternal authority, were now recast as tools of deception. On March 24, 1873, the jury returned its verdict, guilty. Mary Ann Cotton was sentenced to death by hanging. Even at this stage, she continued to protest her innocence. She claimed she had been wrongly accused, that she had loved her children, that illness, not poison, had taken them. Whether these protests were genuine self-deception or deliberate falsehood remains a subject of debate among historians, but the court was unmoved. Her execution was scheduled swiftly. Public hangings had recently been abolished, but executions still drew attention. On the morning of March 24, 1873, at Durham Jail, Mary Ann Cotton was led to the scaffold. Witnesses reported that she appeared composed, dressed plainly, showing little outward emotion. The trap door was sprung, and with that final act, the life of one of Britain's earliest known female serial killers came to an end. Yet the story did not end at the gallows. In the aftermath, journalists and historians attempted to calculate the full extent of her crimes. Though she was convicted for a single murder, many believe her true victim count was far higher, possibly as many as 21 people, including multiple husbands and numerous children. Exact numbers remain uncertain, as not all cases could be conclusively proven. But the pattern was undeniable. Mary Ann Cotton's case left a lasting impact on Victorian society. It highlighted the growing importance of forensic science, particularly toxicology. It demonstrated that domestic spaces long considered sanctuaries could conceal calculated violence. And it challenged deeply held assumptions about gender and crime. The idea that a woman, especially a mother, could methodically poison those under her care forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about trust and vulnerability. In the broader context of criminal history, her downfall marked a turning point. Science had caught up with suspicion. The Marsh test and other advancements in chemical detection made arsenic a less reliable weapon for future poisoners. The case also underscored the need for better oversight of insurance policies and more rigorous investigation of repeated deaths within a single household. For the communities she left behind, the revelation was devastating. Families had buried loved ones, believing fate was to blame. Now they were forced to reconsider every illness, every bedside vigil, every funeral. Grief was replaced by anger, sympathy by betrayal. The woman they had comforted was revealed as the source of their suffering. Mary Ann Cotton's exposure and conviction transformed her from a figure of quiet misfortune into a symbol of calculated evil. Her story became part of British criminal lore, whispered in cautionary tales and studied by historians seeking to understand the psychology of serial killers. She was no longer just a widow navigating hardship. She was a pioneer of a darker legacy, one that demonstrated how manipulation, patience, and knowledge could be weaponized within the most intimate spaces of life. The unraveling of her crimes serves as a reminder that patterns, no matter how carefully concealed, eventually emerge. For years, she operated within the blind spots of her era-limited medical knowledge. Social trust in women, high mortality rates. But once those blind spots narrowed, once suspicion combined with scientific evidence, the illusion collapsed swiftly. And in that collapse, Victorian England witnessed something both terrifying and transformative. The exposure of a woman who had turned caregiving into killing, sympathy into strategy, and domestic life into a calculated theater of death. Mary Ann Cotton's death did not end the story. In many ways, it was only the beginning of her posthumous infamy. Even after the trap door had closed and the rope had done its grim work, the British public remained captivated, horrified, and fascinated by the life and crimes of a woman who had so systematically turned domesticity into a deadly theater. Newspapers of the time continued to report on her case for months, and her story became a source of endless speculation, moralizing, and social debate. The fascination stemmed not only from the sheer audacity of her actions, but also from the unsettling fact that she had operated successfully for years under the very noses of neighbors, friends, and medical professionals. Mary Ann Cotton had exploited trust in a way that seemed almost unimaginable, and the public could not stop asking the question that hung in every conversation about her. How could a mother, a caregiver, and a seemingly ordinary woman commit such calculated acts of murder with such cold precision? In the months following her execution, writers, journalists, and pamphleteers chronicled her life in excruciating detail. These publications painted vivid portraits of the homes she had inhabited, the husbands she had married, and the children who had died under her care. Some accounts sensationalized her as the archetypal female villain, framing her story as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers of feminine wiles and domestic cunning. Others focused on the societal failures that had allowed her to operate undetected for so long, highlighting the deficiencies in Victorian medicine, toxicology, and social oversight. Across all narratives, however, the same chilling image emerged: Mary Ann Cotton, calm, calculating, and meticulous, blending seamlessly into the everyday life of her communities while simultaneously orchestrating death. The impact on the communities where she had lived was profound. Friends, neighbors, and distant relatives who had once expressed sympathy now reevaluated every interaction, every gesture, every instance of grief they had witnessed. Homes that had been sites of ordinary domestic life were suddenly seen as arenas of horror. Families wrestled with the dissonance of memory and reality, struggling to reconcile the image of Mary Ann as a charming, competent, and helpful woman with the revelation of her crimes. The emotional fallout extended far beyond her immediate victims, touching anyone who had unknowingly placed their trust in her. At the same time, her case triggered broader societal reflection. Questions arose about how women, particularly widows, were both empowered and constrained in Victorian society. Mary Ann's access to her victims was facilitated by social norms that granted wives authority over household management, childcare, and food preparation. Her crimes highlighted the potential for abuse within these roles, forcing communities and lawmakers alike to consider how domestic spaces could be monitored or regulated to prevent similar tragedies. Insurance companies, too, were prompted to scrutinize policies more closely, particularly those that could be manipulated through repeated claims by the same household. In a society that often viewed women as inherently nurturing and morally upright, Mary Ann Cotton's crimes exposed the uncomfortable reality that evil could hide behind the most ordinary and socially accepted masks. Historians who have studied her case often note the way she exemplifies a pattern of female serial killers that is both unique and instructive. Unlike many male serial killers, whose violence may have been overt, physically aggressive, or publicly visible, Mary Ann's methods were subtle, intimate, and deceptive. Poison allowed her to manipulate life and death without confrontation that would have drawn attention and jeopardized her plans. Her ability to maintain appearances, to express controlled grief, and to navigate social networks skillfully, all while committing heinous acts, made her both terrifying and historically significant. In essence, she demonstrated that lethality does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it thrives in the quiet, in the unnoticed, and in the spaces society trusts most. The fascination with Mary Ann Cotton extended beyond mere documentation. She became the subject of lectures, moral essays, and even folklore. In some working-class mining towns, parents would invoke her story to caution children about trusting strangers or to reinforce obedience and vigilance. Her name became synonymous with hidden danger and betrayal within the domestic sphere. Victorian society, obsessed with morality and social order, used her life as a prism through which to explore anxieties about women's roles, family structures, and the potential for corruption beneath outward respectability. The tension between her ordinary appearance and extraordinary crimes provided fertile ground for public imagination, feeding newspapers, pamphlets, and storytelling traditions for decades. In modern times, Mary Ann Cotton continues to captivate criminologists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts alike. Her life and crimes are studied not only for their sensational elements, but also for what they reveal about human psychology, social dynamics, and the evolution of forensic science. Toxicology, which played a crucial role in exposing her crimes, has advanced dramatically since the 19th century, but the basic principles of careful observation, pattern recognition, and chemical analysis that caught Mary Ann remain central to criminal investigations today. Her case is often cited as one of the earliest in Britain to clearly demonstrate the potential of forensic science to uncover calculated murder, particularly in cases where traditional assumptions about gender and domesticity could have obscured the truth. Mary Ann Cotton's legacy is multifaceted. On one hand, she is remembered as a murderer who exploited trust and affection for personal gain, leaving a trail of grief that devastated families and communities. On the other hand, her story serves as a cautionary tale and a historical case study, illuminating the intersection of social norms, medical limitations, and criminal ingenuity. She forced her society to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, gender roles, and the vulnerabilities inherent in domestic life. In doing so, she left a mark not only on the lives she directly touched, but also on the broader understanding of crime and detection. Despite her execution and the passage of time, Mary Ann Cotton's story remains compelling because it speaks to universal themes of deception, ambition, and the human capacity for both empathy and cruelty. It illustrates how social structures, cultural expectations, and technological limitations can inadvertently enable wrongdoing, and how observant individuals can exploit these conditions. Her life also challenges simplistic notions of morality and victimhood, prompting reflection on the complex interplay between personal circumstances, psychological tendencies, and the choices that lead to devastating outcomes. In the decades following her death, Mary Ann Cotton's story has been revisited in books, documentaries, and historical analyses, each attempting to piece together the full scope of her life and crimes. Scholars debate the exact number of victims, the motivations behind her actions, and the extent to which her behavior was influenced by her upbringing, poverty, and the social conditions of Victorian England. Yet, despite these uncertainties, a consistent image emerges. A woman of remarkable cunning, capable of manipulating appearances and exploiting human vulnerability to achieve her ends. She remains an enduring figure in the study of criminal psychology, exemplifying the ways in which intelligence, opportunity, and ruthlessness can converge in acts of calculated evil. Ultimately, Mary Ann Cotton's life and crimes continue to resonate because they blur the line between the familiar and the horrifying. She was, in every outward sense, an ordinary woman, a wife, a mother, a neighbor. Yet beneath that veneer lay a calculated methodical killer. Her story forces us to confront the unsettling reality that evil does not always announce itself loudly or obviously. It can hide behind domesticity, charm, and social respectability, waiting for opportunity, observation, and patience to converge. In this sense, Mary Ann Cotton is not just a historical figure. She is a symbol of the complexities of human behavior, the vulnerabilities of social trust, and the enduring power of methodical, concealed violence. Even today, when Victorian England has long since passed into history, Mary Ann Cotton's name evokes a mixture of fascination and horror. She serves as a case study in criminology, a cautionary tale in social history, and a reminder of the unpredictable intersection between human cunning and societal oversight. Her legacy is both a warning and an insight, a glimpse into how ordinary life, carefully manipulated, can conceal extraordinary malevolence. And in that dark intersection of trust, her routine, and calculated intent, Mary Ann Cotton's story endures, a haunting echo of the lives she took and the society she manipulated, compelling us to examine not only the crimes themselves, but the conditions that allowed them to flourish, and the lessons they leave for generations that followed.